Hey everybody, Steven here, and today I'm doing an unboxing video for the Samsung Odyssey G5 monitor. So this is a 32-inch 1440p monitor with a 144 Hz VA panel. So if you watch the channel, I've actually done an unboxing video, and then I did a review of the Samsung G7 32-inch monitor with the 240 Hz QLED panel. Ended up having problems with flickering with that, so I sent it back and then ended up getting the MSI ultra wide that I have now. And I didn't even know that this actually launched. This launched at the end of August, and it kind of seems like they took some components that they already have and then they essentially put it into the same mold or body of the G7. So with this, it doesn't have the same panel, it doesn't have the same refresh rate, and with this I'm actually going to get into that a little bit deeper, but it still has that 1000R curve, which I know is going to be a big draw for a lot of people, and the price point is vastly different. This thing was $380 compared to the $800 that you actually have to pay for the G7. So let's go ahead and get this thing unboxed here and we'll take a look. So excited to see how it translates with the 1000R curve going back to my 1800 and 1500R curve ones. It's been a minute since I've been on the 1000R, but also with the 144 Hertz compared to the 240. This is a much smaller box also compared to the G7. All right, so this is it right here. So this is the 1000R curve with this. If you haven't gamed on a 1000R curve, it's definitely a different, interesting experience. Excited to actually jump back in because I'm still using my 1500 and 1800R curve monitors. But with this, I do want to talk about the differences real quick between this and the G7, just to kind of go through the list of everything, because I know a lot of people are going to be wondering what are those differences, just because the mold with this is the same. Now, one of the big ones here is that if you look on the back, there's no RGB lighting with this. You would have that ring right here on the G7 or the G9. Also on the front, down here in the corners, there's lighting, which actually on the G7, I thought those were speakers, but no speakers. There's no speakers on this either. But down here in the corner, there's no lighting as well right there. So with this, we have the VA panel compared to the QLED that you're going to find on the G7. No RGB lighting with this. Also, if you look at the back in terms of the ports, they're pretty minimal with this. We have an auxiliary port or headphone jack. We have HDMI in, we have DP. HDMI, as far as I know, is 2.0. We have DP, then you have a service USB port for this, and then you have your power port with this, DC 19 volt. On this, we have the holes to VESA mount. That's going to be 75mm by 75mm. And then at the very bottom here, you're going to find this is actually where you're going to put the stand. It's going to hook in right here. Now, in this, the interesting thing is you get the power brick right here, and then you get the cable that'll go from that. You get HDMI. You don't get DP with this. Wondering why that is. I figured they would have at least both, but with this you only have HDMI. I know with a lot of things HDMI can hit that 144 Hertz and all that, but for most PC people, they're usually using DP with this. And then it's still down there, but then I have the stand. So you're limited with this. Now compare that to the G7. You get 2 USB ports as an expansion. This, you can only use this for service. You can't use it for anything other than that, but the G7, you actually get the 2 USB expansions. I use that a lot. If I look at my Acer here, this one has 4. I use all 4. So that's going to be challenging because I got to try and figure out what can stay on my PC and what can at that point. With this also, your stand, it just tilts. The G7, you can actually do a height adjustment. So it can come up, it can actually swivel, and then you have the tilt as well. This is just going to be tilting. So if that's something that's super important to you, something to keep in mind. But because you actually have the ability to VESA mount that, or this, that's actually something to think about as well. And I've actually been trying to mess with doing that with some of my monitors, but I'm still in the process of figuring out which one's going to work. Tried one, didn't work, had to send it back. But this may be one that I actually VESA mount, just because I do need that kind of height adjustment is one of the big ones that I use quite often. Now on the back of this, it's interesting because it looks just like the G7. It maybe looks a little bit different just because they've had to kind of change the molding of this. But we have the Odyssey symbol over here in the back. And so look-wise, I do like the aesthetics of this. And then beyond that, this actually has the 144 hertz panel versus the 240. I mentioned that. A 1 millisecond response time, that is actually the same between both of these monitors. And then this says that it has HDR10 compared to the G7, which said that it's HDR 600, which I messed around with that. I've not been impressed with HDR so far. There's a lot of tinkering that you have to do. You can make a game look really good. I'm not saying that. It's just with all the tinkering you end up doing, it looks really good in one game and then not in another. So I have to go back and tweak those settings. It's so much time spent kind of managing it. It's just not something I typically mess with. And it is one of those things that I've been waiting for HDR10. Everything I have looked and been able to find on this says it's HDR10, which should mean that it has that 1000 nits as far as I know, but I haven't seen anything that has said otherwise compared to the G7 where it says HDR 600. This is HDR10. This has FreeSync Premium versus FreeSync Premium Pro with the G7. You need the Premium Pro to hit the 240 hertz with this, where this, since it's only the 144 hertz, you just need the FreeSync Premium. So you shouldn't have any screen tearing. One of the big issues that I had with the G7 was it's advertised as having G-Sync. It's just G-Sync compatible. It's not true G-Sync. It doesn't have the module with it. So this doesn't say any of that, although I'm sure it is G-Sync compatible, or at least I could turn it on. I don't know if I'll have any issues with that, but I'll definitely check it out. And that, for me, was one of the things that caused a lot of issues, and specifically caused the flickering problem, which is why I ended up returning the monitor. And then I mentioned the panel difference, this being VA versus QLED, and then the adjustment of the stand. So a lot to kind of think about with this. I think this is going to be a solid monitor, especially when you're looking at the difference between $380 compared to $800 for the G7. And if you're on a budget and you're wanting this, like, there's a lot of close similarities between the two. You get the 1000-hour curve. 144 hertz for most people is plenty with this. And then I'm curious to see the coloring. I couldn't find info on this. I could only find it on the 27-inch on their website, and there's not a ton of that info on the Amazon listing. So I'm going to see what the coloring looks like this. Unfortunately, I don't have the monitor, the G7, so I can't do that direct comparison like I'd like to, but I'm a smaller channel. I just don't have that level of money. I'm paying for all this myself, so which is why if something goes awry, I just spend a little bit of time with it, I send it back, and I can get something else and then do a video on that. But for right now, I'm going to get this thing set up. I do have to shoot this in sections. So with this, just my schedule with my normal day job is quite busy. So you're going to kind of see me change potentially shirts or anything like that. I'll try to keep the same shirt on. But with this, it does allow me to spend a little bit more time with this and then kind of round out at least my initial impression with what this has to offer. So with that being said, let's go ahead and cut ahead. I will have this thing set up and I will have spent some time with it. All right, so we're back for the second portion here. I wanted to shoot this video a little bit sooner, but ended up with horrible allergies this weekend, so if I sound off, it's because of that. If my voice starts cracking or anything, it's because of allergies, my throat's drying up, so I may be sipping on my Body Armor Light here in between, just because it wants to like seize up on me. But this did afford me an extra couple days with this monitor, which I'm happy I did, because there's a lot going on with this that I want to cover, which this seems a little bit just more off the cuff. I do have my notes here. When I get to the review, it will be much more structured. But let's cover some specs that I didn't mention with that kind of first portion here. I was able to track some of this information down. So colors with this, 16.7 million compared to the 1.07 billion with the G7. That's different. I will say coloring with this, though, looks really, really good. So the presets out of the box are okay. I don't think most people would use them. You're going to go with your own presets. I've changed this not only with the monitor, but with the NVIDIA control panel as well. An odd thing was the sharpness at 50% makes things pixelated on screen. So I had to actually turn it all the way down to 24 so that it would look normal for me. Outside of that, though, I haven't had any issues with this. I think look-wise, it looks really, really good. Now, let's go on to the color scale with this. This information I had to track down because it's not on the listing on Samsung's website. So if you just Google this monitor, the 27-inch version pops up, the 32, and especially if you specify that, it actually doesn't pop up, which made it a little bit harder to track down. Once you know where you're going on the website, you can find it, but it just seemed a little bit more hidden than the other ones. But once you're there, it doesn't list it. I had to contact tech support. I went through 3 different people, and finally they emailed me the information. So this is 125% of the sRGB scale. That's the same as the G7. This is 90% of the NTSC scale, the National Television Committee scale. But with this, the G7 is 95% of the DCI, Digital Cinema Initiative, right? I'm going to put a link for a website where it's where I go to for the information on these different color scales. And it says that the DCI is 4% less accurate than the NTSC. I don't know if you can do this way, but in my mind, I'm just like, all right, well, subtract that from the DCI to make it so that they're both on the same kind of level, 90 to 91%. 90% with this, 91% with the G7. I don't think it works like that, but in my mind, they're very comparable is what I'm trying to get at with this. And like I said, the coloring looks really good, but I don't have the other one here to do that direct comparison. So we have that 2,500 to 1 for the contrast ratio with this. G7 is the same, okay? So we have that with this in terms of my first initial impressions, get it out of the box and I get going. It plays really well. Games played great on it. Doom at 144 hertz on this thing plays phenomenal. Coloring looks great. I didn't have any input lag. I don't have any ghosting. I don't have any screen tearing. It runs really, really smooth. And it is G-Sync compatible. Not only can you, obviously, it's just there, but when you enable it, it works very, very smooth. That's kind of the big issue, or it has been the big issue with the G7, is the flickering that you have when you enable G-Sync. This not mentioning that it has G-Sync or that it's G-Sync compatible. The G7 saying, hey, this is G-Sync. And it was one of those things I just should have read more into it. I thought it had the module. It didn't. I mentioned this. And so it was kind of, in my mind, touted as true G-Sync when it was just certified G-Sync compatible. This thing is not certified G-Sync compatible, but it runs smoother for me than the G7 did. So like I said, no flickering issues or anything like that. 144 hertz runs really, really smooth. I think for most people, that's going to be the case. That's my standard. I think if you're a professional gamer, 240, 360, you're going to be looking towards those higher resolutions, hertz, and you're going to care less about resolution. With this thing, I think for the average consumer, 144 hertz runs really, really smooth. 120 hertz runs smooth. 144 just seems to be my gold standard now. And then if you look at the menu, because it's an Odyssey, pushing the bottom down here, going up, you're going to find the settings for the most part are the same. Going into game and what you can tweak there. If you turn FreeSync on, you cannot change response time, black equalizer, low input lag, or anything like that. If you turn it off, you can actually tweak those things here. And then with this, depending on the picture mode, things that you could tweak with that. It's very simplistic and easy to use in my opinion, and I like the one button versus multiple, but that's a preference thing also. Now let's get into some of the things that I found with this. One of the big ones is going to be the 1 millisecond response time. You find this on the specs. It's not just, when they say 1 millisecond response time, you have to understand what the difference is. So this is 1 MPRT, that's a moving picture response time, versus 1 GTG, that's the pixel response time. This is the moving picture response time versus the G7, which has the pixel response time. Pixel response time is faster. is the average consumer going to notice the difference? I personally don't think so. Once again, going back, if you're a hardcore enthusiast, if you're a professional gamer, you're going to overlook this monitor most likely anyways. You want those higher refresh rates. You want that 1 millisecond response time. That is that GTG. You're going to go for those things and you're going to be digging in to look for those. Average person, you're just not going to notice the difference, in my opinion. When I do the NVIDIA overlay with this for performance specs, it does show you latency with this anywhere from 2 milliseconds up to 9. I'm not noticing a horrible, like I said, delay in anything. It's just run really, really smooth for me. Once again, an average consumer though. So I did want to point out that difference. You do have to kind of hunt that information down, it seems like. Otherwise, and I don't think this is Samsung's fault. I think this is an industry thing. It's just going to say 1 millisecond response time. You have to dig a little bit into the spec sheet to find, okay, what type, right? So we have that. Response time, if you do tweak it in the settings, if you go to fastest, it is going to make it look somewhat pixelated, and you're going to notice blur with this. So for this, I just leave it on kind of the factory setting. And then the big one is going to be HDR, and this is what I'm going to kind of finish out with all of this. HDR. Looking at the ports on this, this is DP 1.2. I mentioned that it has these ports. I don't think I actually mentioned which variation of that port it is. This is not 1.4, this is 1.2. This does not have the proper bandwidth for HDR at 1440p or 4K. This is HDMI 2.0, which does have that bandwidth, which makes sense then for having the HDMI cable and not a DP cable. I think part of the choice with that also is just saving on costs, obviously, on their end. But with this, I didn't realize that initially. I just booted up, all right, let's check HDR. I actually started playing in Doom, and Doom for HDR has run extremely well. It's actually the easiest setup I've done. Maybe I've just become a little bit more well-versed with it at this point after trying out all these monitors and kind of toying around with HDR. But that was a very, very easy experience, and it's actually looked really, really good as well. Then I was like, okay, this is advertised as HDR10. I need to double check that. So I kind of back off for a second, and then I start looking into it, and you finally do find it. So, and I think this is a verbiage issue. HDR10, so they're saying HDR10. When I look at my TVs and they're advertised as HDR10, that to me, they're saying, hey, that's 1,000 nits. As a standard, that's 1,000 nits. Now, these are monitors. These are different. I understand that. But a lot of times the monitors are saying, hey, this is HDR 400. They don't say necessarily HDR 10. They say HDR 400, HDR 600. And that's how you know what the nit brightness is. Now, I've seen other ones where they say HDR 10, which is making me second guess now if it was 1,000 nits. But I've just come accustomed to that. This says HDR 10. If you look at the other monitors, they say HDR, and then, for instance, the G7 says HDR 600. Doesn't say HDR 10 anywhere. This one says HDR 10. You look at the fine print, it's HDR 600. So this is HDR 600, so is the G7. So those two are the same. With this, it just happened to be an easier setup. But checking into it, I was like, okay, well, I need DP 1.4. Why is Doom working? And I only started to think about that once I booted up Red Dead Redemption 2. That has HDR, nowhere to be found in the settings. Now, this is with it enabled as 10-bit coloring in the NVIDIA control panel and in Windows, saying, hey, HDR for games. I actually have it on right now, and it's looked fine, but it's, like I said, it's making me second guess. I don't think the DP has the bandwidth for this, but for some reason it's working in Doom. So I don't know if Doom is scaling it, whatever it may be. It still looks like it's 1440p, so yeah, it has me scratching my head. I need to dig into it a little bit more. So in order to enable HDR for Red Dead, true HDR, you have to drop this down to 1080p. Once again, going back to the notion of why would they have the HDMI cable? Because if you want to play HDR games, you're going to need either to drop the resolution with this, and it ended up being the same thing for the HDMI. That was my initial impression. Oh, I could do it with HDMI and still do 1440p. It didn't work like that. When I dropped it, and for this, you have to play HDR at 120 hertz. It's not available at 144. When I dropped it down with the HDMI cable to 120, which is what I did with the DP cable to enable 10-bit color, with that, I went to check, not available. Dropped it down to 60, still 10-bit color isn't available, but 12-bit is. So you're going to have to tweak this. You're going to have to change this to 1080p. At least that's been my experience. I'm going to spend more time with it, but something to be mindful of. Outside of Red Dead and Doom, though, I don't have a ton of, or I don't have any other HDR games. It's just not something I've mentioned that I play with it. It just seems like HDR is still in its infancy. So I've been waiting for this to become a little bit more standard, and it's just not quite there yet, in my opinion. I think it will be in the next couple years, but right now, I don't think it's a big draw. So if HDR is a big draw for you here, don't mess with this monitor, right? If you're like me and it's like, I don't really need it, then I think this is an amazing purchase for most people. The HDR settings and all the different tweaking and all of that I've had to deal with, and why it works with DP and Doom Eternal at 1440p, but Red Dead doesn't. But I did change Red Dead Redemption down to 1080p and played HDR, and it was fine. But now I'm playing a game at 1080p, and the HDR at 1080p versus just playing a game in 1440p, in my opinion, isn't worth it. I'll take the better resolution over just HDR, right? So this one has been a tricky one with HDR. I'm learning a little bit more every time I run into these problems, which is awesome, but this one does have my brain kind of racked with this, why I'm having some of the issues with the HDMI cable here. So more research to be done. If you guys have solutions, by the way, I always appreciate if you actually drop me something in the comment section, whether that's another video, a link to a website, whatever it may be. So do I think this is worth the $380 though? For most people, yeah, absolutely, man. If you want the 1000R curve and you don't care that it doesn't have a height adjustable stand or speakers or extra USB ports and all those extra bells and whistles, by all means, I think it's a really good monitor. The stand, by the way, and making the adjustment to this in terms of the tilt, which is -2, tilting forward, and then you can tilt back. It works great. I actually ordered an arm. I'm finally going to try out Autonomous for their monitor arm. But in general, the monitor stand and everything is fine. It does have a little clip in the back so you can hide wires. A little bit flimsy. Does feel like it may break if you pack too many cords in there. But you're going to have the power cable, maybe HDMI, maybe auxiliary, maybe deep. It should fit all of those fine. I do want to talk about the 1000R curve to kind of finish this out. I don't notice any type of, and I've seen it with the G7, I don't notice any pixelation or smearing or ghosting when I come and move something along the curve. I haven't had any problems. I don't have proper equipment to sit here and film it or anything either and kind of judge it based off that. Once again, going back to the average consumer, I don't think anybody's going to notice. The only time I've noticed it in a game, 2 days ago, playing No Man's Sky, I was on a planet. For whatever reason, the coloring while the sun was setting made it so that there was actually bars. It was 2 bars on either side, very definitive bars of color. Once the color changed, it went away, and I haven't been able to replicate it. That's the only time it's ever happened. So as I play more, maybe it'll pop up again, but other than that, like I said, I've had 0 problems. I've played games a little bit further away and then up close to see the difference, because I do think that you're going to have a sweet spot for where this makes sense with the 1000R curve. But at 32 inches, I think 1000R isn't going to be one super revolutionary for most people, or extremely noticeable. I think it's noticeable. I don't think it's as much as you might think, especially when you're looking at an 1800R curve or 1500R curve monitor. It's definitely there. You notice it. It's just not as pronounced as you may think in your head. You get the 49-inch G9, yes, because that thing's going to wrap around here. That for sure, because that's looking at a much bigger size where you have more curve in front of you. This, it's definitely there. But like I said, I don't think it's something that it's going to be an insane improvement if you already have a curved monitor. But I personally do like it. Like I said, I can notice it. It's just not as prominent as I thought in my head. I think I overhyped myself, basically. And that's going back to the G7 when I had that. So that's actually going to round out this. I need to spend more time with this. This went on a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but there was so much that I wanted to cover, and I will definitely condense all of this for the final review. But if you guys have any questions, you have anything that you want me to cover in the review, let me know in the comment section. I will have this in the description, a link for this and for the G7. I'll have both versions, because remember, this comes in a 27-inch. The G7 also does, so you can get a 27 or a 32-inch. But I will have links for that in the comment section. If you guys like the video, hit the like button for me. If you want to continue to follow along with all my content, hit the subscribe button for me. Thanks so much for watching.